Here's the deal, Dave.
It's Greg.
Yeah, I know. I know it's Greg, Dave. But here's the thing. Ever since I put you in charge of social media, it just really hasn't been working out.
It's not my sweet spot. All right. I'm an accountant.
First of all, you don't have to sign your name after everything. What are you, my dad?
Well, again,
And then I have 6 tweets after that just say google.com. Now, I can't even figure out, what was going through your brain when... Were you trying to Google from within Twitter? Please don't answer that. Long story short, my little brother is about to graduate from high school. He's got 10,000 followers. I don't know how he does it. No one does. But we're going to put him in charge of this, okay? So go ahead and send me an electronic mail with the usernames and passwords. Think you can handle that, Dave? Or do you need to write it down on your little pen and paper here?
I can handle that.
Okay, great. And then after that, we're going to talk about your future here at this company. Thank you.
You want an email? I'll give you an email. Oh, that's good. I like that. Dear Hipster Doofus, here are your painfully obvious passwords. You bearded, no good, sneaker wearing. Oh, that's good. I haven't heard language like that since the Navy. Just because Daddy owns the company. Ooh, that's dark. But I like it.
Hey, Greg,
Yeah, Mike.
you know you've been tweeting?
I've been twittering!
Boy, these things can get you in trouble, can't they? Oh, wow. Welcome to Creek Sin. Welcome if you're watching online or a live stream. And we've been in a series painfully called My Big Fat Mouth. And many of you laugh at that video because you are in that video. I've seen some of you sign your Facebook post, Love Nana. You know, I've seen it. But I'm ready to move on to something else because I'm tired of holding myself accountable. Are you? So I'm going to move on to something else starting the next series. But it's very important that we get what God's trying to tell us. Our words are so powerful, and we've been talking about that for 3 weeks now. And if you've missed any of that, you can always go back online and watch or listen and catch up with what we've been talking about. Because we started out by, a little hand motion that we learned. Be quick to listen, slow to speak. So let's do it together one more time as we end this series. Ready? Together? Quick to listen, slow to speak. Again, quick to listen, slow to speak. I see some of you who in high school you didn't participate either. That's okay. We're going to get you one way or another. This has probably happened to you. I'm pretty sure it has because it happens to everybody. It just doesn't always turn out like we want it. I was driving down the road one time, a 2-lane road, and in my rearview mirror I saw this car fast approaching me in my rearview mirror. And then it got to almost my bumper, and then it just stayed there. You ever had someone do that to you, tailgate you for miles and miles? And there's traffic coming the other way, so it was very difficult for this guy to go around me. But he would not back off, and he didn't get the signal that I gave him to back off. You tap your brakes a little bit. You do what you can to back him off, and he would not back off. And finally, I guess he saw his opportunity to pass me. I didn't think it was a good opportunity. There was traffic coming the other way, but he decided he was going to do it anyway. He sped up, went beside me, and he just barely got in the lane before the other car was coming. And I'm just thinking to myself how reckless, you're not only jeopardizing yourself, you're jeopardizing people on the road. And the thought comes to me, where's a cop when you need one, right? So he went on past, he sped up, I lost sight of him. And about 5 miles down the road, I saw the blue lights. And as I came up on the blue lights, guess who the cop had pulled over? There was the car with this guy. And I thought the same thing you would do. Yes. Karma, right? Because what goes around often comes around, right? Well, what if I had approached that car, instead of blue lights, there was smoke coming from that car because he had lost control and he's in the ditch. Then what would my reaction be? Sometimes we would say, well, you deserved it. This is what you get. But that's the whole point of the message today. Because there are going to be times when what goes around does come around, and the powerless will find themselves in a position of power. And when we find ourselves in that position, the words we say will say as much about us as anything else that we do. Because here's the deal. Our words are like stones. We can throw them, or we can use them to pave the way forward. That's what we're going to be talking about today. If you have a Bible, we're going to be in the book of Genesis. The very first book of the Bible should be easy to find. If you need a Bible, they're in the back of the seats there. And, of course, I'm going to put the scriptures up on the screen as well. The thing about today is I've got to cover about 15 chapters. And if I read that, that's all I would have time to do is read it, and we had to pray and go home. So what I'm going to do is I've got in your notes there and on the screen, you'll see highlights, and I'm going to kind of fill in the missing parts in between this because it's a very long story, and I would encourage you to read. We're going to begin in chapter 37, but it takes about 15 chapters before this story is ever finished and told. And what we're going to look at is what I think might be the second greatest story ever told. The greatest story, of course, was when Christ came to the earth to save us, and we're going to be celebrating that in just a few weeks. But this might be the second greatest story because I believe it mirrors what Jesus did for us. If you start reading in Genesis, it takes you a long time before you get to Jesus. But it doesn't take you long in Genesis to come to a person named Abraham. And Abraham is the one whom God gave a promise that his family would become a nation that would be great, that would bless the whole world, because through his family, through his nation, would come the Messiah, the one who would save the world, the Son of God. And so God promises this to Abraham, and it takes a while, but Abraham and Sarah finally have a son, and his name is Isaac, if you're familiar with the story. And Isaac had two sons, and one of those sons was named Jacob. And at that point in time, it's not looking real good, for this supposed nation that's going to come out of this. But things began to get better because Jacob had 12 sons. And now, as 2 or 3 generations of that, you start to see tribes form. And before long, according to ancient standards at least, you've got a nation. But what we don't realize is that the story we talk about today, through the words of one person, that plan that God had, it hinged on this person's words. Could have gone a totally different direction. And so it doesn't look like much of a nation, and through these 12 sons, eventually they would be the 12 tribes of Israel and so forth. But the entire enterprise could have fallen apart if what we talk about today had not happened. So here's what happens. Jacob had a wife named Rachel. Now, he had other wives, he had other sons for, and they did this to propagate, the family and all this kind of stuff. Probably one of the reasons we don't do that today is for this reason. Jacob had a favorite wife, Rachel. Guys, if you learn anything today, don't have a favorite wife, unless it's the one wife, all right? Through Jacob's wife, Rachel, Joseph was born. Now, later on, she would bear another son whose name was Benjamin, but she died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. And so Jacob mourned Rachel, which made Joseph become his favorite. And if you grew up Christian church, or if you're Jewish, you know the story where Jacob loved Joseph so much, made him a coat of many colors. Basically he was the favorite, and everybody knew it. And the 10 brothers knew it, and they were very jealous of Joseph. Well, where we pick up our story is one day Jacob tells Joseph, I want you to go check on your brothers and bring back word to me. They were out watching sheep and feeding sheep, making sure they were all right. Come back and let me know how they're doing. Well, Joseph didn't want to do that. He hated that. He knew how his brothers felt about him, and his brothers didn't like it either. So Joseph decides to go out. He's about 17 years old. He's a teenager. and he goes to check on his brothers. They see him coming. And again, I'm condensing this for you because I don't have time to read it all. They see him coming, and they decide that they've had enough of their younger brother Joseph. And they decide among themselves that they're just going to kill him. Just going to get over with, going to kill him. And but before they do, they decide to have lunch. So we're going to read in chapter 37, verse 25. That's where we're going to pick up the story, okay? As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Now, meanwhile, Joseph, what they've done is they've taken and thrown him into a pit, and the pit doesn't have water in it, but it's just a pit, and he's got to be scared, terrorized, because he doesn't know what's going to happen. He knows he's heard his brothers intend to kill him, but they see this caravan coming, the text says, and the oldest brother, Judah, decided that calmer heads should prevail. And here's what he says. He's having second thoughts in verse 26. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him." And then this flood of compassion, after all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood, and his brothers agreed. So they pull Joseph out of the pit. Of course, he's terrified. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and he sees these strangers, and he doesn't understand their language. They talk totally different language. They take him, they sell him to the Ishmaelites, they tie his hands, and they take him to be sold into slavery. You can imagine the terror that's going through this teenager's mind. He's 17 years old. He doesn't know who he's going to end up with. He doesn't know if the person who buys him is going to be nice to him, kind to him, whatever. And he doesn't know if he'll ever see his homeland again. So, if we skip to chapter 39, verse 1, here's what happens. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And then perhaps the strangest part of this story, which is in fact repeated throughout, it's kind of the theme of the story. In the midst of all this chaos, the author says, the Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And we think, no, if the Lord was with Joseph, Joseph would be home, and the brothers would be sold into slavery, right? I mean, Joseph hadn't done anything wrong. The wicked brothers are getting by with something horrible. And if God is with someone, don't good things happen? And throughout this story, this is a theme over and over and over. But the most amazing thing to me, and a great message for you, and the takeaway is that not only was God in some mysterious way with Joseph, Joseph decided to live his life as if God was with him, even through the terrible things, even though it looked like God had abandoned him. Well, eventually Potiphar notices Joseph's a very talented person, and the years go by, and Joseph had to learn the language, so he learned the language. And as Potiphar recognized how trustworthy and talented Joseph was, he put Joseph in charge of his whole household. Now remember, Potiphar is a high up in the government. He's a captain of the guard in Pharaoh's army. So he puts Joseph in charge of his household. Well, Potiphar's not the only one who notices Joseph. Potiphar's wife notices Joseph. And again, you can read the story. I'm having to condense it here, but she tries to seduce him time after time. And one time she tries and it fails, and he says no. He leaves, but she grabs his cloak and she keeps it. And that night when Potiphar comes home, she takes the cloak and she accuses Joseph of trying to rape her. And Potiphar believes her. And so he has Joseph thrown into prison, thrown into the dungeon. So here's another thing going downhill for Joseph again. And look at what it says if you skip down to verse 20. It says, Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, and here it is again, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison ward. To which I would say, wait a minute. If the Lord was with you, you don't go to prison. She goes to prison, right? If the Lord's with you. And also, who wants to have favor in the eyes of the prison warden? I mean, once people, the prisoners find out who your friend is, look out. But the same thing happened. That relationship developed between him and the prison warden. And before long, he was kind of the administrative assistant over the prison. And we're reminded of something that all of us need to be reminded of every once in a while. That bad things have been happening to good people for a very long time. But God has also been with people in the bad times for a very long time. I'm really condensing here, but while he's in prison, he meets two of people who used to work for the king's butler and the king's baker. They're in prison. They're in this dungeon with Joseph. I don't know what they did. The baker, he probably, maybe the cake didn't taste good. I don't know what it was. But anyway, he's there. And you have to read it, but the butler and the baker, each one had a dream. And it was a very troubling dream. And Joseph had the ability, if you read, to interpret dreams. So he says, hey, let me help you out here. So he interprets the dream of the baker and the butler. Now for the baker, he said, you know what your dream is what it means is you're going to eventually be restored to your position with the Pharaoh. He went to the butler and said, sorry, dude, you're dead. That's what your dream means. And sure enough, both of those dreams came true. The baker was restored to the Pharaoh's household, and then the butler was executed. So what happens later, again I'm condensing, is eventually, Joseph's about 30 years old now. The Pharaoh has a really bad occurrence of dreams. And none of the people in his cabinet can interpret them. And so one day he's talking about these dreams, and the baker's in the presence, and the baker says, oh yeah, I remember when I was in prison, and I don't hold that against you, Pharaoh. You remember that little time that you put? Anyway, there was this guy named Joseph, and he interpreted my dream, and it came true. He said I would be restored, and sure enough, I was. So they go and find Joseph, and they clean him up, and he comes to Pharaoh, and he interprets the Pharaoh's dream. And basically what the Pharaoh's dream was about was that Egypt was about to experience 7 years of famine. And so what Pharaoh said after the dream was basically, and I'm condensing it, and these are my words, but all right, Joseph, what would you do if you were me? And Joseph said, well, I would prepare for that. And Joseph was then, get this, put in charge of the nation of Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh himself. And what Joseph did was he began to tax the grain for the time up to the famine, so that when the famine came, they had plenty of grain and they could sell it. So Joseph is a genius. And Joseph has now become a very powerful person in Egypt. But this famine had also reached outside the borders of Egypt, all the way into Joseph's family, where Jacob and his brothers were. And we're going to pick it up where, because Jacob has learned that there's grain in Egypt. They're in a famine. They need some grain. Look at what chapter 42, verse 1 says. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? He continued, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. So the boys load up, all 10 of them, and they head to Egypt. And the stage is set. And the fortunes have now been reversed. Now Joseph, he's the governor of the land. He sells the grain to all these people. And apparently the boys showed up in the same city where Joseph was dispensing grain. And so when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground, because he was the second in command of the whole land, and they didn't recognize Joseph. The last time they saw Joseph he was 17 years old, terrified. Now he's 30 years old. They did not recognize him. And you know why they did not recognize him? Because he walked like an Egyptian. Anyway, dad joke, I'll hear that over lunch. But anyway, here's the question that we have to wrestle with. And some of you may be wrestling with this now. If not now, you will later. And I want you to be ready. What do you do when you've got the power and your words determine the destiny of your enemy? What do you do when you're in that situation and what goes around has come around? And now you have the power, and what you say will determine the destination of your enemy. And that question, the answer to that question depends on what you did with all your bitterness and anger that we talked about last week. Did you pack it up and take it to the curb and leave it, or did you carry it with you? As these boys bowed down before him, I'm sure there were things that went through Joseph's mind as he remembered, because he recognized them, those nights with the Ishmaelites, hearing them talk and not knowing what they were saying, not knowing who was going to buy him, how were they going to treat him. That day when he was put on the auction block, totally stripped and naked, the shame that he must have felt. That time when Potiphar's wife accused him, he was thrown into the dungeon. All those years in the dungeon, I'm sure all of that went through his mind. And for the next 3 chapters, you'll have to read it, but the next 3 chapters, he plays with them. And he says, you know what? I think you're spies. And they're like, no, we're not spies. We're just here to get grain. And he says, well, do you have any other brothers? And they say, well, yeah, we have one younger brother, Benjamin. He's at home with Dad. And Joseph says, I want you to go get him. Oh, no, we can't do that. You want grain, don't you? I want you to go get him. I'll send grain. One of you is going to stay here while you go get your younger brother. And so you can read about, you can imagine what they're feeling like. Why is this guy singling us out? He's a very powerful person, but why us? Well, he gives them grain, and they go, and for several months, they're back and forth, back and forth. And basically, he's testing them. He's basically saying, are these the same guys that sold me into slavery? Or have they changed? Are they still the same, or have they changed? And I don't know, he's probably wrestling with his own emotions as well. You know, what do I do? What do you do when you have the power and the words you say determine the destiny of your enemy? Well, the whole story escalates, and there's so much detail, and pardon me for just walking around in this, but it's the only way I know to do this. He gets them in a room. Once they're all back in Egypt, he gets them in a room, and he sets them up. He basically makes it look like Benjamin stole something when he didn't, and it goes on, and then he just does something that completely freaks them out. Look in chapter 45, verse 1. It says, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. And suddenly they're alone in the room with this guy who's given them so much attention, and they can't figure out why. Why has he singled us out? Who are we to any to this person? So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and the Pharaoh's household heard about it. You know, imagine this moment when Joseph says to his brothers, he's been waiting for this. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? Now check this out. But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence, and they wetted their robes. I got to make sure you're paying attention here. And that last part is not them, that's me. But I can't help but wonder, when he said, I am Joseph, if the bowels just didn't release. Holy moly. Because here's what you may not know that I do. With one word, Joseph could have had all 10 of his brothers executed. And the way the Egyptians did execution, the Romans, crucified, the Egyptians impaled. And what impaled means is they would take a person, they would have a stick with a point on one end, and they would start from the bottom and go to the top. And they would start from the bottom, pick them up, stick that stick in the ground, and the body would slowly, the weight of the body would push down through the stick. And you didn't die till it got to your heart. One word, 10 poles. And they wouldn't do it at the same time. They would do it one at a time. They would put 9 brothers on the ground tied up, first brother up. It would take literally all day. One word, Joseph could have done that, but he didn't. Joseph said, is my father still living? He had no idea what was happening back at home, but his brothers, of course this makes perfect sense, but his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified in his presence. And they were rehearsing as well what happened when Joseph was 17 and all that they did to him and all the bitterness that he must have toward them. But here's what he decided to do. Instead of settling for being right, he decided to make things right. Remember us talking about that a couple of weeks ago? What Joseph could not have known was that God's plan for the ages dangled on the thread of his next words. Before him sat 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, through whom God was going to bring a Savior. And for that to happen, they had to be alive. And what Joseph did for his brothers, the Savior of the world did exactly for you and for me. And why? Why did he forgive them? Because he didn't carry around all that bitterness and anger. Because he lived as if God was with him, because he trusted that God was with him through the bad. Look at how it ends in chapter 50, verse 18. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, verse 21, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. And here Joseph stands up, he embraces all of them, and he says, I want you to go home. I want you to get dad. I want you to get your family. I want to get your kids, your grandkids, bring pictures. Just get them all here. And I'm going to take care of you right here. I'll protect you. I'll make sure you're fed. I want you to come home to me. And that's what he does. So how does this story play out for us? What does it mean for us? And what I'm about to say is a mouthful, but I need you to write it down. Okay? Now here's what it means for us. I'm going to put it up on the screen. You will never experience the good that comes from the bad unless you recognize God was with you during the bad, and then you refuse to play God when things are good. And that's a mouthful. But you will never experience the good that comes from the bad unless you recognize God was with you during all that bad stuff. And you refuse to play God when the tables turned. You see, one day, and maybe one day soon, you're going to have the power over someone who hurt you, over someone who stole your childhood from you, over someone who stole a marriage from you, over someone who stole your job, who fired you from a job. You're going to have a power over someone who talked about you and destroyed and stole your reputation. And you're going to find yourself and someone who hurt you now needs you. What are you going to say? And if you're carrying around that bitterness and that anger, then what comes out of your mouth is not going to be good. And it's certainly not going to help the relationship. But our words are like stones. You can throw them, or you can use them to pave the way forward. That's up to us. What are you going to do when what goes around comes around? What are you going to do with the words? All that depends on your perspective of what between then and now and how you dealt with it. And my hope is that you will take the cue from the one who gave his life for you, not the one who hurt you. That's my prayer. Are you going to throw stones? Or are you going to use them to pay?